Hello, everybody. We're here today for the final webinar in a series that was hosted by the Issue-Based Coalition on Gender. We want to thank UNFPA again for hosting us for this series to really disseminate and provide information about the guidelines on SDGs and gender that were produced by the Issue-Based Coalition last year. Today we have presentations on the SDGs and gender, considering the life cycle approach. And the presentation again will be presented by Aysel Bazarova. We really appreciate Aysel's work. She's helped us from the very beginning, has been our partner as we developed the guidelines and through the webinars. So thank you very much, Aysel, for joining us. Dr. Bazarova has nearly 15 years of experience in the field of gender and development, with particular expertise in gender mainstreaming and gender analysis, gender-based violence prevention and response, and the empowerment of rural women and girls. She lives near Washington, D.C. and travels extensively, working on regional and country projects with UN agencies in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Dr. Bazarova is an alumni of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and Indiana University's Central Asian and Uralic Studies program. She's a member of the National Women's Studies Association in the United States and the Feminist Task Force in the American Evaluators Association. Today, we'll also have presentations embedded in the overall general presentation, taking a deep dive into looking at child marriage with Joanna Horn. She is a gender and development research and communications expert. She's been working for over 10 years in the field and has got particular knowledge of gender equality and women's rights. Since 2012, Joanna has worked on projects with a child protection and child marriage focus, including a global overview of the determinants of child marriage for the region. Joanna has a PhD in development studies from SOAS, University of London, and has taught gender and development studies at SOAS as well. And then finally, we will have an intervention from the Gender Theme Group in Kyrgyzstan, and we're very lucky to have Tatiana Prokhorova joining us from Bishkek. So I'd like to hand the floor now to Aysel. And again, thank you very much for supporting and presenting today.
Thank you, Maha. It's my pleasure. I am very happy to be here today. It's the final, as you said, in the series of webinars that we have. And the idea was to actually delve deeper into the topics that we covered in the guidance note on SDGs and gender, but of course, the topics that require further examination, further explanation. I will also would like to thank you and Nigina and other members of the Issue-Based Coalition for all the support that I received in in the process of us developing the guidance note, developing the advocacy brief, and of course on the work on the webinars. It's by all means a teamwork. So it was a privilege to be a part of this team. I think it's actually a very good occasion to present the final webinar on the life cycle approach, specifically now in March, because it's spring. We are starting the cycle. The spring is here. I would like, this is the region that celebrates the spring holiday of Nowruz, which I celebrate too. So I would like to say Happy Nowruz to everyone who is celebrating the beginning and the spring. And it's a wonderful context for our presentations today. So I'm ready to start whenever you are. If I may ask, can we bring or should I do it, the presentation to the screen, or should I do it from my end? Thank you. Thank you. So the topic for today's webinar is the Sustainable Development Goals, Gender and Life Cycle Approach. The life cycle approach is a type of look and the framework that we use in order to capture and analyze changes happening throughout a life of an individual, but also changes that connect generations. They probably, because so many of us worked in the area of gender mainstreaming, women's rights, and of course GBV, the first thing that comes to mind when we mention life cycle approach is the very well-known spiral of domestic violence. It very much captures the idea of violence happening at different stages throughout human life and impacting the earliest stages, impacting the further stages, and having this lasting impact throughout life of an individual. So as an example, there's an excellent visual representation of it prepared by Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on domestic violence. We see how it starts in infancy with sex-selective abortions, with infanticide, with malnutrition that is in some societies very much gendered, with little girls receiving less nutrition. And we all know that it has long-lasting effects. Then it moves to the childhood years. It moves into teenager, adolescence, with, of course, for our region, early marriage. Child marriage is very much an issue, and we will have a chance to hear about it from Joanna today. We move then into in this visual into young adulthood, with dating violence, with denial of choice in marriage, so forced marriages, intimate partner violence, then adulthood and all types and forms of domestic abuse, economic abuse, coercive control, and then of course the violence that happens in older years with gender-based component of it, including the sexual and physical and economic violence against older women. So we see this spiral, and the idea of spiral, the idea of connection between inequality, well, in this case specifically violence that happens at different stages of life, that is specific for this age groups, but that has this lasting impact that doesn't just finish, as we all know, when we look at the, for example, physical violence against women in connection to psychological violence. These are scars that last a lifetime. These are psychological scars, and these are lasting physical, negative physical outcomes. If we could move to the next slide, please. So the life cycle approach analyzes various stages in human life as interconnected elements of a single system. I would like to stress this again, this systematic approach. We see it. No, we need to go back. I'm not finished with it yet. The systematic approach, looking at something as an interconnected system, we have already encountered it in our previous webinars, because whenever we look at SDGs, we talk about interconnected system. Well, life cycle approach gives us the same framework. However, the framework encompasses the whole entity, entire human life. So several specific important characteristics of this framework. As I said, it has a very strong focus, allows us to focus on specific problems that affect specific age groups. Think about the specific problems, and then, of course, think about specific age-specific custom-made solutions. there is a strong connection to the principle of leaving no one behind that was a topic of our previous webinar. And we look at it and we see that building capacity should be seen through a life cycle lens, tells us the Human Development Report of 2016, because people face various types of vulnerabilities. If you remember, those of you who've been a part of the previous webinar, we talked about vulnerabilities, the idea of vulnerability, and how they tend to accumulate. And the interesting thing here is that we were talking about vulnerabilities as causing people to have less chances to benefit from development. Well, life cycle approach, what it allows us to do is look at different age groups and see, okay, well, what are the barriers that stop these groups from benefiting from sustainable development? Can the development be really sustainable if we see that certain age groups do not get an access to services, are subject to several intersecting inequalities? So the life cycle approach allows us to look at different age groups. It allows us to look at accumulation of capabilities, right? How does, for example, poverty affect child's ability to access justice in later life? There is a research that is well documented that looks at the long-lasting effects of child poverty, that children who had a chance to accumulate these capabilities earlier in childhood are more resilient later in life. And the children who have been deprived of those, they suffer these consequences. This is not deterministic. This can be changed, but it decreases, shrinks their chances to benefit from development, not just in childhood, but at earlier stages in their life. It also, as I said, looks at accumulation of vulnerabilities, and it also, which is very important for us and which is very much a focus in SDGs, it looks at inequalities and it helps us to unpack the intergenerational patterns. Importance of sustaining capabilities and opportunities throughout an individual's life cycle, but also for subsequent generations. Again, health of mother and health of her child, the violence experienced by pregnant women and its impact on later stages of development of her children. These are all connections that are there, and life cycle approach allows us to look at how they reveal themselves within the individual life, but also how is trauma transmitted between generations, how poverty is transmitted between generations, how lack of access to justice or certain services is transmitted from parents to children, and thus decreases the opportunities for children to benefit from what is already there, for example. So if we could move to the next slide. If we look at life cycle approach and gender equality, we see that very much a lot of intersections here, and the idea is that, again, we look at this framework with a kind of utilitarian approach of what can life cycle framework give us that will help us address problems of gender-based inequality, gender-based violence, the violation of children's rights, and we definitely see that it's a fairly productive framework, especially when it's coupled with the gender-sensitive lens. We see that there are these intersections of age and gender that allow us to see problems and to see these vulnerabilities that we otherwise would possibly miss. And again, for our region, we can look at the school dropout specifically of girls and boys, and different reasons behind it, different factors that cause it. It also allows to develop more targeted solutions and age-specific interventions, and it analyzes the lifelong accumulation of inequality-based barriers. So if I may take us back for a second to our previous webinar, we looked at these barriers and how the concept of intersectionality allows us to capture these multiple barriers. Well, what we saw is the axis of intersectionality that would allow us to look at, for example, the barrier of racial inequality, ethnic or religion-based discrimination, gender-based discrimination, and poverty, right? That would, at given moment in time, make it much harder for a person to access services, to fight discrimination, and so on and so forth. However, if we couple it with the life cycle approach, then we can see how all of these factors also accumulate throughout this individual's life cycle. And that allows us to capture the intersecting nature of these barriers, of these inequalities, even in a more detailed way. So, for example, if we take a family that, let's say, lives in rural area and has the certain problems that they encounter because they have hard time accessing services, if we look at how will that impact the chances of, let's say, girls in this family or boys in this family to get good education, to get quality healthcare, and if they don't get it, how will that later in life impact their chances compared to children that had these opportunities in competing for good jobs? So we see these intersections between the barriers caused by differences, inequalities in gender, in age, and so on. And we see how different vulnerabilities accumulate through the course of life, and that's what life cycle approach allows us to capture. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Excuse me. Now, what I would like to stop here for a minute, because we have a term, life cycle, used in SDGs, but I would like to just issue a little bit of a warning here, because the life cycle is used in SDGs as a term in a slightly different meaning, well, in a considerably different meaning actually, because it's used specifically in SDG 12 Target 4 to designate a management of waste and its impact on production and environment. So we look at life cycle approach that affects human life, but there is also a considerable body of research that is used in development that looks at life cycle of production and its impact on the environment. Of course, that process also has an impact on different age groups. This process is by no means gender neutral. And just a short example, we see this life cycle of a t-shirt, for example, here, and we can immediately, conclude that the cycle that is basically described as fairly neutral in this visual has its own very clear gender implications. For if we take our region and if we look at, again, impact on human life cycle, production of cotton has an enormous historic impact on individual lives and on societies. In our region, we know about use of child labor in cotton production. We see this, that produce this little t-shirt, you need to start with harvesting cotton. Well, this rings very true for our region, because this is the exploitation of women and child labor. There's a toxic fertilizers that are used in this production, were used to a larger extent, are still there. Low wages, exploitation of labor, the women in textile industries, precarious jobs. So all of these elements are definitely there, and they affect both life cycle of an individual. They affect the society. We see this angle in SDGs as well as the pure attention to different categories and stages of human life that constitute life cycle approach to human life. Okay? Excuse me. One second. I'm sorry. Maryland's vegetation's here and my allergies are acting out. If we could move one slide more. So now let's look at the 2030 transformative agenda for sustainable development and look at how a life cycle approach is reflected in the agenda and its goals and targets, and how useful can it be for us in order to achieve sustainable development with the gender-sensitive approach to it, which is ultimately our main goal within the guidance note and the series of webinars. So transformative agenda for sustainable development is, as you all know, a global action. It covers next 15 years, and it's a charter for people and planet in the 21st century. So it's kind of limited in terms of years that it covers, but its vision is much larger than the 15 years between 2015 and 2030, because the policies it proposes are of a really, really ambitious nature, as we know, and the vision is much larger. It covers children and young women and men as critical agents of change. If we could move one slide more, please. So if we look at the text of preamble, we see that those whose needs are reflected in the agenda, we see the categories. We see that it gives us children, youth, persons with disabilities, people living with HIV/AIDS, older persons, indigenous people, refugees, and so on. So some of these categories that are invoked in this document already refer us to different stages within our life cycle. It also talks specifically about women and girls who must enjoy equal access to quality education, economic resources, and political participation, as well as equal opportunities with men and boys. So this is something that we see all throughout the Sustainable Development Goals, the categories of women and girls and men and boys, which definitely show us this attention to transition from earlier stages of life to later stages, and also a focus on gender age intersection. If we could move one slide more, please. If we look at the scope of transformative agenda in terms of years, it's really interesting to see how much of a life, if we're looking at it from a life cycle approach, what is the share of our lives that this agenda covers at the moment. As I said, it covers 15 years between 2015 and 2030. 15 years is 1/5 of an average life expectancy in Eastern Europe, where women are 78 and men are 68 years old on average. That's the lifespan, expected lifespan. But if we imagine this little boy or little girl that were born in 2015, they will be 15 years old in 2030. So whatever policies that are adopted within the SDG implementation and nationalization will start affecting them. However, they will hit this period of adolescence, the challenges of it, right at the end of the period allocated for the Sustainable Development Agenda. And what life cycle approach does, it actually urges us to think beyond 2030, right? We know that there's a global Europe program strategy that thinks all the way to 2050, and that is probably again very much in line with the life cycle approach, because if we're talking about the generation, well, the generation that was born in 2015, a girl, for example, or a boy born in 2015, will be 78 in 2093, right? This person will probably already be retired. This person will be dealing with the different challenges of retirement, of the of aging, of health issues. Here we have the life cycle approach allows us to go beyond 15 years and look at this diverse demographic challenges of rising inequality, significant migration, climate change, transformation of labor market. Look at how all these challenges will affect human lives beyond this 15 years. Whatever policies we adopt will have to be thought through, and later evaluated in terms of their impact beyond 2030. Because whatever policy we adopt for this 15-year-old will have to take into consideration what will happen with this 15-year-old boy and girl. What kind of problems are we helping them to face when we adopt these policies from 2015 to 2030? What kind of policies, what kind of fundamentals do we have to lay in right now in order to help 75, 78-year-old person that is at the moment a little child? So it really helps us to develop this really long-term approach to the framework suggested to us by Sustainable Development Goals. We could move one more. Thank you. The life cycle approach also calls us for anticipatory analysis and long-term policies, as I said. The anticipatory analysis is a type of analysis that tries to look way beyond current situation, look at trends, look at soft and hard trends, and see which ones are likely to affect the society as a whole and specific age groups. And what needs to be done in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term impact. So not all of our policies obviously will be long-term. Not all of our policies have to be long-term. There are some issues that have to be tackled straight away. And a life cycle approach, again, helps us to understand and to make this distinction between, if we're looking at the policies within the SDG framework, which of those will have a short and are designed to have a shorter term impact, medium term, and then which are the ones that take a longer term view. To develop and implement policies connected to several related stages of human life cycle, these are very complex policies that invest in, for example, children's education, however, also take into consideration for example, the link between the education we are promoting and future demands of the labor market, right? That's another problem that is very much relevant for our region, where we have a fairly high level of education. However, a lot of this education does not really match well with the developing demands of the labor market. And the life cycle approach also allows us to evaluate the impact of policies on future generation, how the current generation and what we do for current generation will impact the next generations. So if we could move one more. Now, compared to Millennium Development Goals, in terms of life cycle approach, SDGs do indeed offer a fairly considerably wider range of opportunities. First of all, it is expanded, complex framework in terms of what types of life, stages of the life cycle it looks at. And I will show, there's a slide where I will show you all the different categories that we find in various SDGs and targets, the categories that are relevant for life cycle approach. We'll have the whole list. It also, that is very important, compared to MDGs, SDGs include the recognition of aging, which is really not there. Older people are not acknowledged in were not acknowledged in Millennium Development Goals as a separate category. And aging was not acknowledged as a phenomenon that presents considerable challenges, but also presents opportunities. Aging is very important for our region, and aging has its own very specific, unique character in our region, where as you know, the societies are aging, individuals are not necessarily aging, and when they're aging, they're not aging in a healthy way. So the aging in many of our societies in our region goes because the fertility rate goes down, not because the life expands. And when people are older, there is a much lower chance to have a healthy older years compared to, let's say, Western Europe. So definitely the attention given in SDGs to the process of aging and to older persons is very important for our region and for implementing life cycle approach in programs and strategies in our region. It also addresses structural conditions behind intergenerational poverty. That is, again, important for us because the SDGs have this very strong focus, as you know, compared to MDGs, have very strong focus on inequality, but they also offer us a wide range of targets and indicators that allow us to address the challenges of inequality and poverty at earlier stages in life, basically investing into earlier stages of life of the individual in order to overcome the challenge of inequality. Increasing the access to education, increases the access to quality healthcare as a means to, not just means in itself, but also a way to bring people out of poverty and expand their possibilities, their opportunities, and expand their chances to benefit from overall sustainable development, thus eliminating the groups that are left behind. So we have this very strong connection between inequality, the attention to different stages within life cycle, and sustainable development. This connection is really well spelled in the examined and addressed within the SDG framework. One more, please. Next one. So this slide is actually a list of categories that correspond to different stages within human life cycle and that are mentioned, addressed within the Sustainable Development Goals framework, within different SDGs and targets. And we see that some of them have to do with the age, some of them have to do with gender and age, some of them have to do with age and gender and one additional specific condition factor. So we have newborns, we have children of all ages, like a broader category, we have girls and boys, we have children under 5, that's a separate category, we have adolescent girls, we have youth with the age range defined, we have adults, we have men and women, we have pregnant women, lactating women, older persons. So as we see from this list, Sustainable Development Goals as a framework, as a policy framework, is fairly sensitive to stages in human life cycle and offers different goals and targets addressing specific issues that affect these specific categories. We could go one slide further. So So here, I would like to attract your attention to another very important aspect of life cycle approach and the way it's reflected in SDGs, and it has to do with its use of gender as an accelerator. We see that if we take, let's say, sustainable development goals that look and targets specifically that look at addressing challenges, problems faced by age categories, earlier age categories, or by mothers, for example, or by newborn children, we see how the attention to specific gender angle of it is very important, and it allows them to then to be the achievements, the capabilities to be transferred to later stages. So we see the attention to the health of mothers and newborn children, to reproductive rights, and we know how important the tackling the problem of skewed balance between boys and girls is for our region. We have this a scary figure of 177,000 of missing girls. Then we move to, and we can do it if we'll go through this specific SDGs, we move to SDGs that address age stage within the life cycle of under 5. We see the attention to different forms of malnutrition, and then we have an indicator that allows us and recommends us to look at how it affects girls and how it affects boys. Is there a discrimination against girls? Are girls getting less nutrition because they're believed to require less, or because they're believed to be less important? Or maybe it's the other way around. Then, of course, the SDG 4 and again SDG 5 with its focus on education, that's yet the next stage. And again, there is a very clear attention. There is within the twin track approach of looking at SDG 5 as standalone goal, but also mainstreaming gender within goals and targets. So we see this attention to age and gender, and we see how it, again, pushes the idea that we accumulate the capabilities, we eliminate the vulnerabilities going from one stage of life to another, and you can do it here. And then there is a whole group of different SDGs that look at access to governments, economic resources, addressing unpaid labor, social protection, and so on and so forth, with focus on gender aspect through the indicators or directly within the target. So we can actually see how SDGs, how policies within SDGs can be constructed alongside the axis of life cycle, the ones that address earlier stages, the ones that address nutrition in childhood or education, and then the whole range of subjects where inequality stops girls, boys, or men and women from benefiting and accessing the benefits of sustainable development. We could move one slide further. Another approach, or another way to look at the life cycle approach within SDGs is to, and that can be easily done, is to look at how a specific age group, gender and age group, for example, girls, right? You can take girls between 6 and 11, for example, how they are affected and how different policies suggested within Sustainable Development Goals can help us address the issues faced specifically by this gender and age group. For example, with girls, we definitely can use SDG 5. We absolutely can use SDG 16.2 with reducing violence, trafficking, and sexual violence. We can definitely look into different targets and indicators under SDG 1 with living in poverty and increasing social protection. We can definitely look at SDG 6, and SDG 6 here connects actually to SDG 16.2 because SDGs, as we know, are this very much interconnected system, because access to sanitation and hygiene for women and girls especially, we know it because of the experiences of refugees in our region as well as in the other parts of the world, it's access to sanitation and hygiene for women and girls that is very often connected to the increased risk of sexual or physical violence in refugee camps, in territories affected by conflict. SDG 4 with its attention to early development, access to education. So we see this whole group of various SDGs and targets that can be used as policies to address issues specifically faced by this specific group, age group and gender group, and specific stage within the life cycle, if we choose to do it this way. So if we could move to the next one, please. Another group to look at is boys and men. And here we have several challenges that, again, can be addressed through the wide range of means offered to us by Sustainable Development Framework, but also through the life cycle approach. Well, the first thing that immediately, of course, we all know and immediately comes to mind is this vast difference in life expectancy between men and women in our region. Here it says Eastern Europe, but it really is a problem for the whole region. We see this difference between the data that we have for Eastern Europe with the indicators for Northern Europe and Southern and Western Europe. We see not only the difference in general life expectancy, but also very much a pronounced gender gap, with men very much disadvantaged here, and whatever policies that will be adopted in order to address this issue will have to use life cycle approach. They will have to use life cycle approach to look at what in these previous stages triggers this outcome for men in our region. If we could move once again. One of the challenges of course, we face here in this case is the scarcity of data. And again, I would very much like to bring to your attention the fact that Sustainable Development Goals very much acknowledge the lack of data and bring the idea of expanding data, of using different indicators, of the tiers of indicators that are being used. If you want to look at some resources, our guidance note actually had the whole section dedicated to it, subsection dedicated to it. So we see that boys definitely are an age and gender group that has its own challenges, that these challenges start in childhood with boys in agricultural manual labor. Specifically, I'm talking about our region here. They are also a part of a migration flows and sometimes illegal migration. The exploitation of child labor is definitely affecting this group. Violent deaths are higher among adolescent boys and men. Children in violent conflicts, boys are there as victims, but also can be dragged into armed conflicts as participants. We have a suicide rate 2 times higher among men compared to the one among women. So we have this troubling data that comes in, but it is, we have to admit, for our region fairly incomplete, very much in need of further expansion, further examination, but it does indicate that at different stages in life, men and boys meet this unique gendered challenges that very much are in need of further examination and definitely should be subject to policies within SDG framework. If we could move further up. What I tried to do with this slide is really chart a path that Sustainable Development Goals as a framework allow us to chart to address some of the issues faced by boys and men in our region. And this is just a suggestion. Obviously, the path can be expanded, more SDGs, more targets, specific indicators can be added here. So this is just a suggestion of how one may envision the approach that takes different SDGs and targets and puts them together as a certain path of policies that should be implemented in order to address various issues faced by boys and men within their life cycle. So we start with child labor. We move into lower secondary school enrollment at upper age in some countries of our region, Armenia, in Croatia, in Kazakhstan, in Moldova, in Serbia. I want to mention here that in other countries we have girls with lower secondary school enrollment. So here we have, right in the lower part, you will see the SDG with specific targets that allow us to adopt policies addressing this particular issue. There is alcohol and tobacco use. There is higher exposure to physical violence. There is unemployment and specific pockets of high unemployment among young men. For some countries that of our region that are expecting or are already within experiencing the youth bulge, the inflow of a large number of young men and women into the labor market, definitely the unemployment can be a very, very, very challenging situation. And SDGs allow us to and call us for looking into policies that can address this issue. 2 times higher rate of suicide, as I said about that, lower life expectancy. So various SDGs allow us to create the chart, this path of policies that should be implemented in order to eliminate one by one different challenges that specifically affect men and boys throughout their life cycle, taking into consideration that the earlier problems will have a lasting impact. If we could move on. This is our slide number. May I ask you which slide number is that? I think it's the time for us to. It's the time for us to invite Tatiana Prokhorova to share her experience. And as Maha introduced her, Tatiana Prokhorova is a program specialist.
On that one.
Excuse me?
Michele, if you're comfortable.
Tatiana, I think can you hear us? This is Maha from UNICEF.
Yes, hi Maha.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for joining us today. We wanted to take a break and thank you first for joining us and invite your intervention on behalf of the Gender Theme Group in Kyrgyzstan. Tatiana is a gender program specialist with UN Women. Go ahead, Tatiana.
Yes, thank you very much, colleagues. First of all, thank you for inviting me to giving opportunity to present on our work in Kyrgyzstan, and thank you so much also for this very comprehensive presentation, which gives very nice, I would say, intersecting kind of challenges and how they intersect with each other, these sustainable development goals. Just very much from the grassroots level and project level and community level interventions experience, I would like briefly to discuss, to present on the UN Women in Kyrgyzstan, how it is working on the series of several including they included several components where we are working at the policy level and at the national, local level, but at the same time, large components of those projects were working with youth. They include, we developed 2 courses. One of the courses called My Safe and Peaceful School. It is taking through peer-to-peer approach and involving high school students as a main beneficiaries and through extracurricular activities at schools for grades 8, 9, 10. the course is very, I would say, comprehensive, and it teaches critical thinking and gender equality, of course, and advocacy skills, especially very important on the civic identity, involving the boys and girls who get together and discuss their problems and issues and build the capacity through series of training. It's for the one academic year. And they develop their own action plans, and later on involving the school administrations and local self-governments to implement those plans at their local communities. In total, we have trained around 6,000 students from 60 schools all over Kyrgyzstan, and the course has been approved and recommended by Kyrgyz Academy of Education since last year, and moreover, we are now working with the Ministry of Education and Science to develop and include this course in part of the civic education in the school curricula. The new school curricula in the Kyrgyz Republic has been adopted recently, last year, and the main focus and request from the ministry was under the new educational policy, to develop such a generation of youth who will have developed their critical thinking through the school, which usually the normal school subjects don't bring. So it was very strongly recommended to focus on inclusion of the civic education course, and we are part of it. We are working closely with the ministry, and at the same time trying to build the capacity of educational workers. Another course which is called My Prosperous Farm, which is working involving again the school students as a part of the extracurricular activities, where the young youth, high school students are learning how to on some of their livelihoods activities and effective use of natural resources, mainly water. As you know, Kyrgyzstan has lots of issues on scarce water resources, and Central Asia in general, so lots of conflicts in these issues. And then, of course, part of those two courses, a main focus, teaching the students how to resolve conflicts, be much more tolerant, and as I mentioned, the civic identities. So under this course, also around 5,000 students have been trained, graduated this course successfully, and we have several successful stories where our graduated students, they become agents of positive change, and they are participating in all these activist movements and trying to promote gender equality and women empowerment. So that's basically it. And then, of course, with the local self-governments, we are working to develop their capacity to ensure that they're including youth at the local level decision-making processes. In several new programs, we are also focusing on the emerging trend on this prevention of violent extremism, where we are also planning to train lots of youth how to critically think and media literacy using to media and communications. So that's basically it for the specifically on the educational parts of the UN Women. We have been extensively involved in these educational programs, and if any questions, we are ready to answer. And then, yes, apart from this on the policy levels, of course, youth and this included in a new NAP on 1325, which is being developed, and UN Women in Kyrgyzstan also lead of gender thematic group, and leading the process of the development on new NAP on gender equality and women. So thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. It's really a good example of one of the program areas that UN Women is doing a contribution to the Kyrgyzstan UNDAP, which includes an outcome on good governance, rule of law, human rights, and gender equality, as well as an outcome around social protection, health, and education. And we recognize how much work there is done through the gender theme group to bring all of the agencies together around promoting education for young people. And I know many of the projects that you've described today are done in an interagency process with other agencies also supporting governments and contributing to the outcome under the UNDAF. So thank you very much for that. Aysel, I'd like to return the floor to you. We can take questions at the end.
Also like to thank Tatiana, and I want to, just listening to you, I would like to say that I'm very impressed by how well you identified the gap, because critical thinking is absolutely a gap in the education that has been accumulating in the region for quite a while because of the certain ideological restrictions to start with, but also how important it is that you start at the earlier stages, teaching the skill of critical thinking and then connecting it to three areas: to the gender equality, to bringing positive change to communities, and to decision making in governance. This is really well tied, and it really addresses a gap that is absolutely there and that we encounter in every a project that we basically are working on in the region. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Going back to our main topic, if you remember, those of you who were part of the previous webinars, within the guidance note, or in parallel with it, as a part of it, we also put together a chapter on gender within the advocacy brief for the region. Within this chapter on gender, we identified 9 regional trends that are important for gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. I will just list the trends really briefly before we move to looking at how these trends affect or can be interpreted within the life cycle approach. So we have persistent barriers in access to justice for women and gaps in implementing laws on domestic violence or gender-based violence. We have a wave of extreme conservative cultural and political positions that's on the rise. The harmful practices that are persistent, such as sex-selective abortion and child marriage, the harmful practices that are persistent and that are sometimes legitimized within these ultra-conservative discourses that are on the rise in the region. We have a weak mandate and insufficient resources of national machineries on gender equality, decline in official investment in services for women and girls, and in gender equality in general. We have gendered implications of austerity measures, the decrease in the funding allocated for family supporting infrastructure, while everybody who works in our region knows the situation with kindergarten and childhood care facilities. The increase in which in itself has a very clear gendered element, because it increases the dependency of families and communities on women's unpaid labor, and further ties women to the private sphere of home, which very much fits into the goals of the previous trend. So we also have the fact that despite relatively high labor force participation of women in the region, the economic empowerment is still lagging behind. There is a gender gap in wages. There's vertical and horizontal occupational segregation. There is women constitute a huge number of people in precarious jobs. They are restricted. They have restricted access to credit, financial credits, and knowledge, necessary to start their own businesses. Women continue carrying the main load of unpaid work, in some parts of the region up to 5 times more than men. Civil society, historically a strong channel for women's social and political mobilization, is currently under severe pressure in some parts of our region. Combine it with slow progress of women in political participation, where many political structures are male-dominated hierarchies, and we see the shrinking channels for women to voice their discontent, to participate in making decisions that affect their lives and life of the society as a whole. And we have another trend: the benefits of demographic dividend are undermined by gender inequality for those of the countries in the region that currently go through this potentially very beneficial stage. And we have population aging that I talked about quite a bit already, but just to stress the gender element of it, elderly women are a majority of those in this group, and they, because of accumulating inequalities, discrimination throughout their life cycle, have very considerably smaller economic and other resources at the end of their life accumulated, and that makes them more dependent. And that opens channels for violence, for discrimination, for old age poverty. So here are these 9 trends. Combine them with incomplete data, and here we have a situation that definitely affects life cycle of individuals and future of societies in our region in a fairly profound way. So if we could move one slide further. So here what I have put together is this table that basically lists the trends that I already mentioned to you. You see it on the in the blue section. And then in the green section, you see how each trend can affect and affects people in different men and women in different stages within the life cycle. Again, as my previous visualizations, this is a suggestion. It can be altered. You can add the elements to it. It's a way to look and dissect the impact. So, for example, we see that conservative wave and how harmful practices affect girls, for example, in infancy and early childhood. We see that definitely with child marriage, there is an effect in adolescence. For example, if we look at unpaid work, it starts affecting, indirect effect will be felt by everyone, but directly affecting boys and girls, starting with adolescence, in adulthood, more for women, of course, because they carry the main load of unpaid labor. Definitely in older age, because of the crumbling infrastructure in our region, and because the lack of investment in public services, babushki, right? That is a phenomenon in our region. The grandmothers carry a huge load of unpaid labor and care that in other circumstances would have been a function of free quality public services. So we see that how every trend affects different life stages, but also contributes to accumulation that I mentioned before. I hope you'll find this table useful. As I said, it can be expanded, it can be changed, but this is one way of looking at how these trends that we identify can affect different age and gender groups and can be put together, forming a whole life cycle impact, which is very much a theme of our webinar today. So if we could move further. Finally, yet another way of looking at it, just like a kind of zooming in into one trend, which is the lack of lagging economic empowerment of women. Again, we can break it, as you see, into the influences and challenges that start in childhood, go through adolescence, affect women in adulthood, and bring their final negative outcomes in the old age. And then in this middle section, I place the SDGs and targets that help us address specific issues faced at every stage in the life cycle that are an outcome of this negative trend. So we have the access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education that is definitely a problem in our region and can be addressed through the SDG 4.2. We have early and forced marriage, just affect both girls and boys, girls to a considerably higher extent. Early school dropout, child labor, these are SDGs and targets that can help us develop policies addressing these specific issues. We have gender disparities and stereotypes in educational choices, very much limit girls' future chances to find a job, because in many countries of our region, when you do your research and you ask what are the most popular educational choices for the girls, you see doctor and the teacher. That very much, and if you compare the choices of boys and girls, you will see how much more diverse educational opportunities for boys are in terms of choices. And that, of course, has an effect on the chances to find a job in this tight labor market. We have digital gender gap, a very important challenge in the light of, again, requirements of a new age. We have then unpaid work and care. We have women and men in precarious employment. So whenever you look at the problem in the dark green section, in the kind of pinkish section, you see the SDGs and targets that help us develop policies addressing this specific problem. And then in its entirety, we have the whole path, or rather accumulation, that results in this negative trend of women lagging behind in economic empowerment in our region, despite the fact that we exhibit fairly high level of labor force participation, and educational achievements are impressive when we look at the region compared to other regions. So if we could move to the next one. And I think that is time when Maha will probably want to once again introduce Joanna.
Sure. So now we're going to take a deep dive into child marriage in Europe and Central Asia. And we have Joanna Har, who is going to present on some of the work that she's done with UNFPA and with UNICEF and with others in the region, the World Bank. And we really are looking forward to understanding again the life cycle impact and dimensions of child marriage in our region. Joanna.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Aysel, for a very interesting and stimulating presentation. If we could move straight to the next slide, please. Great. Okay, so I've now been involved in 2 regional level studies looking at child marriage in the Europe and Central Asia region. The first was a study for UNFPA in 2012 to 14, and then I'm now involved in a study for UNICEF last year and this year. We've looked altogether over the period of these 2 studies at 16 countries and territories in the region. In the Balkans, Caucasus, Central Asia, and then also Turkey and Ukraine. And for both of these desk reviews, we looked at prevalence of child marriage, legislative frameworks in place across the region, drivers, impacts, and also barriers and bottlenecks to action on the issue. The UNFPA review also included an element of qualitative research, so actually going and talking to young women and some young men who'd been affected by child marriage in countries across the region. And then for the UNICEF study that I'm working on now, I'm also mapping program interventions specifically addressing child marriage in our region, and also other areas of program work that are helping to address some of the drivers and the impacts of the practice. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of prevalence, as is the case globally, this is an issue that primarily affects girls in Europe and Central Asia. Child marriage does affect boys in some communities. For instance, in some Roma communities in the Balkans, there are adolescent boys who are affected by child marriage, but primarily we're talking about girls. There's huge variation in prevalence across the region and also within countries. So you might have a country with a very low prevalence rate at the national level, but then very high prevalence among certain communities. So for instance, among Roma. Although that said, it's quite difficult to compare prevalence across the region because the data that's available is so very, very different. So in some countries, we have very good recent up-to-date DHS data or data from the multiple indicator cluster surveys, and in other countries, we just don't have that data. So regional comparison is quite difficult. And again, this points to the importance of having good in-depth qualitative studies to fill some of those data gaps. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's driving child marriage in this region, the two, obviously, every national context is different, and it's very important to look at what's happening at the national level and at the community level to really understand what's going on in terms of what is driving child marriage in a particular context. But at the regional level, I think there are two very strong trends, which are restrictive gender norms on the one hand, and then poverty and social exclusion on the other hand. So in terms of restrictive gender norms, we're talking about things like huge importance placed on the idea of honor, on ensuring that a girl or a woman is a virgin when she marries, and that sort of putting pressure on families to make sure that their daughters are married off as early as possible to make sure that they're still virgins. And then sort of connected to that, this idea that a girl's or a woman's main role in life is to be a mother and to be a wife, and sort of that closing off other possibilities and other opportunities. But poverty and related issues around social exclusion are also very important drivers in this region. So many families may end up marrying off a daughter in order to ease financial pressures at home, but also a girl may agree to a marriage or want to marry because she sees that as a way out of a very difficult situation at home. So a way out of poverty and a way out of overcrowding, for instance. In terms of impacts, early motherhood is an almost inevitable and very immediate impact of early marriage, of child marriage in this region. Married girls are under a lot of pressure to get pregnant as quickly as possible. And obviously, by implication, that means that they probably have little control over sexual contact, little control over birth timing, birth spacing, access to contraception, issues like that. Data from DHS and mix that we have for this region also indicate that, as is the case at the global level, that married girls are much more vulnerable to domestic violence and sexual violence and physical violence from husbands and from in-laws than unmarried girls are, or older married women. Married girls are often very isolated. They marry, and what tends to happen is they almost immediately lose contact with friends, they lose contact with peers, they lose contact sometimes even with, or have very restricted contact with parents and with siblings, and so they sort of very quickly become very isolated within their new households, and that has quite considerable impacts on health and well-being, particularly psychological and emotional well-being. And then, of course, school dropout is very closely interlinked with child marriage in this region. It's the relationship between school dropout and child marriage is quite a complex one, but there is definitely a link there. And really just sort of coming back to Aysel's presentation, what we're talking about here is child marriage kind of being a trigger for, I would say, a group of vulnerabilities, cumulative vulnerabilities that, as Aysel said, will then go and impact on that particular girl as she grows into adulthood, on her capacity to benefit from development, really. I think that's quite clear. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, apologies. That should, of course, be SDG Goal 5, not SDG Goal 3. So within the SDGs, we have a specific goal on achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And within that, we have a specific target on child marriage. So eliminate all harmful practices such as child early and forced marriage, and FGM as well. And then an indicator that goes along with that target, specifically on child marriage. So, this is a very strong recognition of the fact that child marriage does negatively impact on obviously the well-being and health of individuals, but also on other development outcomes as well. But in terms of sort of thinking about how we can use the SDGs framework, I suppose more constructively in terms of thinking about project and program work to positively impact on reducing child marriage and also on mitigating the negative impacts of child marriage for married adolescents. We can really think about quite a few other of the SDGs as having a positive impact, potentially having a positive impact on reducing child marriage, but also vice versa. So work on reducing child marriage and reducing the negative impact of child marriage can help feed in towards realization of some of the other SDGs. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we think about the SDGs as a whole, I've come up with 7 in addition to goal 5, which I feel are really closely interlinked with child marriage and work that we could be doing to be addressing child marriage and eventually eliminating it. So the first SDG 1, end poverty. Poverty is a major driver of child marriage. It's important to point out that not every family living in poverty or every household living in poverty is going to resort to child marriage as a coping mechanism. They have to be in an environment where child marriage is already socially acceptable, where there are social norms that are supporting that. But all the same, child marriage and poverty are interlinked in our region, and so any work addressing high levels of poverty will also contribute towards reducing child marriage. SDG 3, health and well-being. Child marriage, of course, negatively impacts on the health and well-being of married adolescents, and there's also been some studies indicating that babies and young children who have adolescent mothers also have negative health outcomes. So again, work towards SDG 3 would also help to be mitigating some of the negative impacts of child marriage. SDG 4, inclusive and equitable education. Again, child marriage and school dropout are closely interlinked. So, putting it bluntly, the more girls that you're able to keep in school and keep engaged in school, the less likely they are to end up marrying before the age of 18. So, again, any work on improving inclusive and equitable education and making sure that more girls are able to complete schooling is going to have a positive impact on child marriage. But then so those are the kind of the 3 really obvious SDGs that have very clear and obvious links to child marriage. But I've identified another 4 that I think work in these areas will also help bring about an ultimate reduction in child marriage as well. First is SDG 8, sustainable economic growth. Of course, sustainable economic growth means better and more decent employment options available, and that one would hope would lead to more parents and adolescents themselves seeing work and future employment as a more viable option for girls, and then hence again helping to reduce the desirability of child marriage. SDG 10, reduce inequality. What we see particularly in our region is that rates of child marriage are often much higher within social groups that experience significant inequality. So the obvious example is Roma. Rates of child marriage are much higher amongst Roma communities than they are amongst wider population groups. And one factor feeding into that is the severe inequality that those communities face. So again, work on reducing inequality could have a positive impact on reducing rates of child marriage. SDG 11, inclusive and safe cities. Many parents will give wanting to protect their daughters from the threat of sexual violence or from physical violence as one of the reasons that led them to decide to marry her. And so again, however, tandentially work on improving safety of the physical environment is likely ultimately to again feed into efforts to reduce child marriage. And then finally, SDG 16, peaceful and inclusive societies. I mean, this goal includes a target specifically on eliminating sexual violence against children, and child marriage is a form of sexual violence against children. There's no two ways about it. But also, again, the threat of sexual violence is something that's is a reason given by some parents for wanting to marry their daughters off. And I think I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure you may have questions for Faisal and for myself and Tamara. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna and Aysel and Tatiana. I'd like to open the floor. We have 5 or 7 minutes for questions, and then I'll give the floor back to Aysel for final. If you have a question, please raise your hand, including Nagina Abazali from UNFPA, who's here in the room, and Nerve, Aaron. So we have some questions, yeah. So the first question is, Aysel, do you consider migration as one of the key factors in the region for a different impact on age and gender groups? And then we have another question, would it be possible to receive? Yes, of course. We'll be, at the end, we'll share with you by email the link, not just to this recording and PowerPoint, but also to the other presentations that Aysel has done for the group that she's referred to during the presentation. So Aysel, how would you analyze migration and the intersection of migration vulnerabilities in terms of age and gender consideration?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. A very interesting question, a fairly complex one. Obviously, we know about the gendered aspect of migration. We know that women and girls tend to have around higher risks of becoming a part of illegal migration, with all the negative outcomes and further risks of that, heightened vulnerabilities. But another important part of the whole migration issue, we touched upon it in the last webinar, if those of you who were there remember, the children of labor migrants that are left behind, and all the range of outcomes still not researched enough, right? We are now only starting to look into this and to look at the psychological impacts, social impacts that are lived through by children who were left behind by mother or father or both, who had to migrate because of economic situation. These children are left with relatives or with grandparents, and even the initial research that was done in Ukraine and Moldova shows that these children live through psychological problems. They feel left, they feel abandoned sometimes, they feel socially different from the others. So yes, there's definitely, these are outcomes that affect different stages of the life cycle. Absolutely.
Thank you. And then the next question is actually just a request for more information on the child marriage work, particularly intervention against child marriage. And I think Nagina and I were thinking it might be good to actually organize an entire webinar on the child marriage programming that not just UNFPA, UNICEF has done, but also all of the other agencies working on education, social exclusion, political participation. All of this, of course, has a bearing on child marriage. So I think we'll leave that question for another webinar and schedule one later this year. We have 5 minutes left, and I just want to acknowledge or thank everyone for joining us. Acknowledge that this is the week of International Women's Day. We're looking during this week at the specific aspects of vulnerability associated with intersectionality. Today we've been discussing age and gender. We've also looked at some of the compounding factors such as rural and social exclusion, which are the focus of the CSW next week. I want to just thank everybody for joining and send the floor back over to Aysel for some concluding remarks.
Thank you. Well, I actually had one last slide. We don't need to even look at it. Just to mention where I was talking about the positive sides of the life cycle approach, but as any approach, it has its limitations, obviously. And what, in combination with SDGs, however, what it helps us to do is also to look at what kind of limitations SDGs have. So just as a very brief warning, when we look at the SDG framework, we see that it's still confined to this period of 15 years. So there's a certain short-termism that is there that we need to take into consideration. Talked about that. Older people are mentioned mainly in relation to mobility. So transport, access to public spaces. Of course, aging opens much wider range of issues. And then, of course, specific challenges faced by men and boys are not sufficiently highlighted within SDG framework. We can still address it by adding indicators, for example, by expanding the reach within the localization and nationalization. So it's not, it's not the end of the world that it's not there, but we just need to be aware that these certain limitations are there. As my final remarks, if we could move to the very final slide, please. I just want to say that the way I look at what we've done within this last year and a little bit is basically contributing to conceptual framework and practical tools that can be used in order to conduct SDG implementation, nationalization, and localization in a gender-sensitive way. We have the guidance note. We have the regional advocacy paper with the gender chapter that outlines the 9 trends. Guidance note, as you know, outlines 4 stages of SDG nationalization and localization. And you can always go look and see what can be done at every stage in order to make sure that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is mainstreamed within the process. And then we have our 4 webinars. Just to remind you, we had a webinar that was dedicated specifically to discussing the guidance note. We had a very good webinar on SDGs and gender-based violence and violence against women, looking at what type of framework does SDG give us in order to address the issue. We had webinar on leaving no one behind, inclusion, looking into inclusion, intersectionality, and gender in sustainable development goals. And finally, the current webinar looked at yet another angle of it and gave us another framework to work with when we conduct our SDG implementation, and that is a life cycle approach. Together, again, they give us this range of weapons, if I may go into militaristic metaphors here, instruments, much better, that can help us in nationalization and localization and making sure that women and girls and men and boys are within the center of our attention as very specific categories with specific needs within the SDG implementation process. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Aysel. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Tatiana. We'll be sending links to all of these resources as well as the previous webinars. And we'd like to also get your feedback on these webinars. What were they? What was helpful? What more information would you like? What additional webinar topics are you interested in through the end of the year? So this is Mahamuna from UNICEF, Regional Gender Advisor, Gina Abazadi, the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the issue-based from UNFPA. We send you off for a productive week of International Women's Day and next week's CSW. We'll stay in touch and thank you again for joining today.
Thank you.